Hello everyone, my name is Terry Morgan and I serve on the LDHR VP team. We're very glad to have you join us for this webinar. We're going to be discussing the leadership pipeline process. Before we get started, I want to quickly cover just a few logistics. If you wouldn't mind, please make sure that you mute your microphone and turn off your video. That'll give us a few less distractions and give us a little more bandwidth for our presenter. On the other hand, feel free to ask questions or answer Dennis's questions using the chat box. And if you would you please just make sure your chat is set to everyone so that we don't miss any of your comments. We'd like to start at this point of just seeing who's with us. Maybe you'd like to put your name and where you're coming in from in the chat box right now. And while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce our presenter. Dennis Metcalf is married to Dong, and they live in Singapore. Dennis has been married or has been working with LDHR, Leadership Development and Human Resources, for 15 years at both the area and the global levels. Presently, he serves with the LDHR resourcing team, and though he considers himself primarily an LDHR generalist, he's invested hundreds of hours researching and helping provide the resources to assist our LDHR leaders in the implementation of the leadership pipeline process. So it's a real privilege to have Dennis with us. Dennis, we're looking forward to what you have to share with us. So I'm going to let you take it away now.
Thanks, Terry. I'm looking forward to it too. Welcome to our second LDHR webinar. Our webinar today is on leadership pipeline process. We really glad you're here. We trust that this will be helpful to you, and we do want this to be interactive. So be sure and join the process by typing your questions, your comments into the chat box. It's difficult on an international webinar to turn on our mics and everybody speak with the lag times and other difficulties with audio. So yeah, keep your mics muted, but go ahead and feel free to type any comments, questions in the chat box, and then Terry will bring those up as we go along. If you haven't done so yet, be sure and leave who you are and where you're calling in from. As we start our time, let's begin with a word from our sponsors. Now, the webinars are presented by the resourcing team. By the way, if you can't hear, it might be because you haven't turned on your audio yet. Make sure if you can't hear me, you probably can't hear this, but you can read the statement at the bottom. Make sure your audio is turned on so that you can hear. A couple of people last webinar weren't able to hear, so they ended up dropping off. So, word from our sponsors. This is presented by the resourcing team. We resource in a number of ways. We are helping resource your priorities in several helpful toolkits and websites, communication that connects and informs. There are regular communications that are sent out. We have a global LDHR community GCX site and our global LDHR Facebook community. And speaking of the Facebook community, if you're not a member yet, please join, and you can do that by messaging my lovely bride, Dong.Metcalf, and asking her to connect you to the site. Well, our commercial's over. Let's jump right in to our topic today. We're going to be talking about the leadership pipeline process, and you're probably on the webinar because, one, you see that it is important, but also, two, that it's a complex process. Our purpose today is to gain a greater understanding of the leadership pipeline process, and even more importantly, to gain insight on how to implement it effectively in our unique country stage, culture, situations. So once again, if you have any questions or input at any time, go ahead and type those into the comment box as we go along. And there will be a question and answer time at the end as well. You know, many of our ministries are experiencing a leadership crisis, encountering difficulty in providing the leaders needed to fulfill our God-given mission. The leadership pipeline process is our primary method to help ensure a steady flow of the quantity and quality of leaders we need to achieve our ministry goals. So let's start with a brief description of the leadership pipeline process. The leadership pipeline process consists of the processes that ensure a steady flow of the quantity and quality of leaders to ensure the accomplishment of the mission. And although we're probably familiar with the concept of leadership pipeline process, many of us may be familiar with the diagram and would even be able to explain the diagram to others. Unfortunately, the implementation of the leadership pipeline process has been fairly limited, and the results often fall far short of expectations. So here's our agenda for today. Really 4 things that we're going to deal with. The webinar is going to address both the art and the science of the leadership pipeline process. I guess the science part is we're going to give a brief overview of the leadership pipeline process to understand what it is, what are the steps involved. And then review why do we need to prioritize the implementation of the leadership pipeline process. You know, some of the most of the difficulties we experience in implementing the process are more related to the art of implementing the process. And so we're going to deal with that too. We're going to discuss what barriers might limit our effectiveness in implementing the leadership pipeline process and how do we overcome some of these barriers. And for this, we're going to need your input as well in some of the issues that you've been facing implementing the process. And we're also going to look at, consider how we can inspire ownership for the effective implementation of the leadership pipeline process by our leaders. Now, some of the issues that come up will be common issues that we all experience to some degree. But these issues also will be affected by our unique ministry developmental stage, our culture, situations that our ministry has faced in our history. So the implementation of the leadership pipeline process, our unique situation requires artistic creativity and skills, which we hope we'll be able to touch on during our webinar today. So let's start with a brief overview of the leadership pipeline process and look at a familiar diagram. I'm sure that many of you have seen this diagram. I think it's important to remember the leadership pipeline process is not just one simple process, but it's a somewhat complex blend of a number of processes that need to be artfully integrated together for best results. It's both a science and an art, as we've already mentioned. Although we might have a basic understanding of this diagram and maybe even have shared it with others, I think the struggle in implementation deals with the art of how do we use it in our unique situations. So that would really be the focus of our time today. However, we do want to talk about the steps. So let's briefly review the steps of the leadership pipeline process. The first step is to identify who do we need, what leaders do we need for current leadership positions that are vacant. What leaders do we need for succession, those that we know will be stepping out of leadership positions in the near future? And what leaders do we need for our expansion plans? As we do our strategic planning and have expansion plans, we're going to need more qualified leaders. The second step is to assess. Who do we have? Who do we have that is currently ready or has potential to be able to fill these leadership needs? The third step is to develop. We've identified the people with potential to fill the leadership needs. What do they need in order to be equipped and ready to step into those roles and transition into those roles? And then the fourth step is to deploy. Who fits best? Who's the most appropriate person for this particular role? And this involves both the areas of selection, how do we select the appropriate person, as well as the area of helping that person have a fruitful transition into their leadership role. Once again, if you have any questions or input, go ahead and type that into your comment box. Now, it might be helpful to look at this from another perspective. Leadership pipeline flowchart. Different people think in different ways. Diagrams are great for some people. Flowcharts work great for some people. In fact, if you're a real flowchart geek, we've got a much more detailed flowchart that is on the websites as well. So let's take a look at this pipeline from a flowchart perspective. The first step is to identify what is our leadership need. And our primary venue for doing that is our annual leadership strategy meeting of the leadership team. Secondly is to assess the readiness and potential of our staff to meet those leadership needs. And the primary venue for doing this is in our annual people meeting of our leadership team. Thirdly, is to develop potential leaders. We've identified the leaders, now we're helping equip them to fit into those roles. And our primary venue for that is a process that we're already using, the staff development cycle, particularly the key developmental assignments section. And then fourthly is to deploy, where we implement different leadership transition processes, the selection process and the transition process, to ensure that we're able to select the most appropriate person for the role and help them fruitfully transition into that role. Now, we've developed some toolkits that will help you in these areas. I'd like to introduce those to you now. If you haven't checked them out, check them out. The toolkit that deals with identify, assess, and develop step is the People Pathways Toolkit. And you can find it very easily at people-pathways.org. We also have a toolkit that deals exclusively with the deploy step. It deals with the selection process and the transition process, the Leader Transitions Toolkit. And the whole process is supported and accelerated by the use of our staff development cycle. Terry, are there any questions that have come up so far?
Dennis, not yet, so you must be explaining it very clearly.
I hope so. Okay.
I'll pass them on to you if I get it.
Okay. As we look at this flowchart and these processes, I think it's also important to realize that the first three steps are different in application than the last step. So it might be helpful for our implementation to look at them somewhat separately. So what's the difference? The first three steps of the leadership pipeline process, identify, assess, and develop, are all regular part of our annual ministry cycles. Our annual leadership strategy meeting, our annual people meeting, and the annual staff development cycle, looking at the key developmental assignments. Step 4 is different. It's not part of our annual rhythm or cycles. It's implemented as needed when a necessary leadership position is vacant or soon will be vacant. Any questions about this? You can go ahead and type them in as we move on to the next point. Our next thing we want to talk about is our need to prioritize the leadership pipeline process. Several things I want to bring up here, and this certainly isn't exhaustive, but one is our undeniable need for leaders. We started our time talking about the leadership crisis that many countries are experiencing, not able to produce, develop, place the most qualified and right, effective leaders in leadership positions. A couple of issues that come up with, our vision for movements everywhere so that everyone knows someone who truly follows Jesus is going to require leaders everywhere. So there's an undeniable need for leaders, not only for our current situation, but as we expand to help fulfill the Great Commission that God has called us to do. The second need to prioritize is that the leadership pipeline process steps must be proactive and intentional. They're not going to happen by chance. They won't happen by accident. It is not a thing that happens by osmosis. Something that we need to intentionally practice, that we need proactively practice. So it needs to be prioritized. Thirdly, our current practices are not serving us in the ministry well. I think most commonly used practice is really not a pipeline process practice. It's more of a replacement practice that we're surprised when a leadership position is vacant. We go into crisis mode and panic and try to replace the ongoing leaders. That process is not serving us well. Sometimes we get it right, but many times we really don't. Fourthly, is that we need to have a belief that the investment made to implement the leadership pipeline process steps will produce rich dividends for the future. The implementation of the leadership pipeline process will take a time commitment. It will take effort to do it right, to do it effectively. But we need to believe that the results far outweigh the cost. You know the saying, no pain, no gain. There really aren't any shortcuts to implementing the leadership pipeline process. Now, our toolkits have tried to reduce it down to the most basic, user-friendly processes and tools. But it will take time. It will take effort to implement it. Anything that you'd like to add? And I'll go ahead and move on to the next point. And as you do type things in, we'll either talk about it in the question and answer time at the end, or Terry can bring them up as we're going along. Next, we're going to talk about our third point that we brought up, and that is the barriers that limit leadership pipeline implementation. What are some of the barriers? What are some of the hindrances for our implementation? Well, one, and very easily, is a lack of understanding of what it is. Our leaders, many do not have a clear understanding of what the leadership pipeline process is all about. Even many of our LDHR personnel may be familiar with the diagram, but really difficult to explain. We needed basic education in layman's terms to be able to explain what the leadership pipeline process is and how to effectively implement it. Probably the biggest, as I've asked people for feedback on this, the biggest answer, the most often quoted answer is the area of busyness. You know, the reality is that our plates are already full. Our leaders have limited times to be able to meet and to focus on things. And if they don't appropriately value the leadership pipeline process, it will never make the agenda. It's something that's important, but there's not a really urgent felt need. So the priority perhaps isn't there. We get sucked up into the tyranny of the urgent. And there's really no time to focus on implementing the leadership pipeline process. Another area is the lack of staff, lack of manpower. We don't really have a pool of leaders to choose from. We aren't really seeing many new staff join. Younger staff sometimes don't aspire to leadership. They see how busy the leaders are and they say, no, that's not for me. Thank you very much. And struggling just to, sometimes our ministries are struggling just to keep our heads above the water. And it's hard to think about implementing a leadership pipeline process. The next barrier or hindrance is our lack of long-term planning regarding people. We often have a short-term mentality. We're satisfied with our status quo, so we really don't think about the future that much. Leaders are often don't plan to step down. I see that as, in my area anyway, see that as maybe a lifetime role, and sometimes feel threatened when younger emerging leaders poke their heads up. The other issue that has come up is no strategic expansion. If we don't have a national strategic planning process that causes us to look ahead and see how we're going to expand and reach uncharted territory, reach new ministry opportunities, then really there's no need for a leadership pipeline process. Our current replacement process is probably good enough. But we really need to begin looking at the future, looking how we're going to expand strategically to other ministry opportunities and not be satisfied with the status quo. And then the last one I have here is ineffective processes or systems. Our current crisis leadership replacement process becomes a habit. And it's difficult to change. People are resistant to change. We're satisfied with the way things are going. Our processes perhaps are unclear and ineffective. And yet we still kind of stick with the old adage, well, it's not too broke, so we don't need to fix it. So those are some of the hindrances as I've asked input and feedback on the leadership pipeline process that has come up. And I bet you have some other ones, so go ahead and type those in to the comment box. But the second part of this question is how can we overcome? Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead and ask you a few of the questions that have come through.
Okay.
One of the first ones, you mentioned a couple of toolkits that either support or explain this leadership pipeline process. Can you let people know where they can find those?
Yeah, these are open websites. So they're open for anybody to use at really any time. The People Pathways Toolkit is on people-pathways.org. So just type that into your URL and that'll take you right to the toolkit. Leader Transitions Toolkit is at leadertransitions.org. And then our Staff Development Cycle Toolkit is staffdevelopmentcycle.org. Excellent. Does that answer the question, Terry?
Yes, it definitely does. There's another question that says that you've been mentioning developmental assignments as being an important part of the leadership pipeline process. Could you give some examples of that kind of what a development assignment would be like?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. The third section of our position focus sheet is for the team leader to think of a developmental process, a key developmental process for the person to help equip them for greater leadership opportunities. One example would be perhaps our staff member has good skills in evangelism and discipleship, but really hasn't had experience in leading a team, leading through other people. And that's something that we want for a leader at the next level, someone who's able to lead through a team, to build into a team, and also making a strategic plan for a team. So one of the perhaps possible key developmental assignments that the leader would think of would assigning that person to lead a short-term mission project. Is that helpful?
Sure, that's a great idea. I've got one last one here for you, and you've mentioned a lot of the barriers. You mentioned that sometimes leaders don't really view the importance of the leadership pipeline process. And maybe you're going to get to this, but what are some of the ways that you know for helping the leaders get past that and helping them to actually really grasp the importance of the leadership pipeline process?
You know, that's a great question, and it actually ties into our next point. So let's wait until our next point to get to that.
Perfect.
Okay? Good. Hey, thanks everybody for getting those questions in. Please keep them coming, because our question and answer time could be an extended time, and it would be very silent if we don't have any questions. Back to this slide, the barriers. An important thing to think through is how can we overcome? How can we resolve some of these issues? And I think for each individual situation, there may be slightly different ways to do that, but this gets into the art of implementing the leadership pipeline process. One thing that's probably the most helpful is to make sure that we as a national ministry have a clear mission, vision, and goals. That we've spent time in our strategic planning process, that we see have a clear mission, vision, and goals. That helps us to have clear priorities and could help deal with the busyness issue. If you see the need for the leadership pipeline process, you're able to prioritize it above other maybe urgent things. Maybe even lack of staff or manpower, as we have a clearer vision, mission, goals, that it will attract more people to join the movement. The lack of long-term planning, of course, connecting our strategic people plan with the national strategic planning process, make sure that we see the needs coming up for leaders. So having clear mission, vision, and goals helps solidify our priorities and will help deal with some of these issues. Another one that a friend brought up, the leadership pipeline process definitely needs to have good vision casting. We need to have champions of the leadership pipeline process to cast a vision for it, to make sure our leaders and other members of our movement clearly see its value and are able to prioritize it. And then having some best practices, developing some models and some best practices that people can see how it really works and is able to yield positive results. Those are a few areas. Once again, if you have any other ideas or questions, go ahead and type them into our comment box, and we'll bring those up. But let's go on to the fourth topic we want to talk about today, the fourth point. And we're going to need to talk about this issue of how do we inspire ownership for the leadership pipeline process implementation? How do we cast a vision? We really need to have champions for this process. We need to exercise the spokesperson role and sell the process so that others will see the need for it, prioritize it in our ministry. So here are a couple thoughts. Once again, this is not a complete list. If you have other ideas, please feel free to share those as well in the comment box. First of all, is that we need to connect the National Strategic Plan and people development together. We need to clearly show how this will contribute to the fulfillment of our mission. Andrea gave some really good input. She said if the process is introduced by itself without connection to the strategic planning process, it will just feel like another outside initiative, a bureaucratic and unessential initiative that's being forced upon us. The lack of connection between strategic planning and people development is what needs to be established. And she goes on to say, I would hate to have people implementing the leadership pipeline process when they don't have a substantive national plan that shows why and where we need people in the future. So yeah, we need to connect, make sure we're connecting our national strategic plan and people development plans together. We need to make sure that we have good follow-through. People see how these fit together and produce the need for it. The second thing is an idea to use a few well-placed questions to get leaders thinking and influence their leaders' thinking. There are some questions. Actually, the diagram itself starts out with some really good questions that will help us to think through. Who do we have? Who do we need? What leaders do we need to meet our current and future leadership needs? One of my friends, LDHR leader, just sits down with the leaders and just asks these questions and helps them think through without even showing the diagram, without even using the name leadership pipeline process. But who do we need? What leaders do we need for current and future needs? Who do we have with readiness or potential to be able to meet those needs? What do they need? What kind of equipping, development do they need? And who fits best? How do we select the most appropriate person and ensure that they have a good transition? Those are some good questions that can help stimulate the thinking. We need to have some well-placed questions to get our leaders thinking, to help them probe their perhaps currently unfelt but real need for the leadership pipeline process. There are some other good questions in the one of the tools in the identify step is the identifying leadership needs worksheet. On the second page, kind of an appendix of that worksheet, there's a list of different questions to help answer different sections of that worksheet that are strategically based questions. The next one is that we need to make the need feel painful. Bruce Wilkinson in the 7 Laws of the Learner talks about we need to help the students feel the need. Otherwise, application just won't happen. We need to illustrate how the results far outweigh the cost, the time investment, the effort. And coming up with some real stories of leadership pain, of issues that have come up because of our ineffective processes. When leaders, even in replacement, when it's chaotic and ineffective, some of the pain that our ministries experienced as a result of that. Next is making our systems and tools user-friendly. Sometimes they come across as being so complex, so difficult, so time-consuming that we really don't want to make that investment, aren't able to make that investment. If our systems, our tools are too complex or difficult to use, well, they just won't be used. So we need to make sure that they're user-friendly, but we also need to make sure that they're easily accessible. Oftentimes we have some really good tools, but nobody knows they exist, or nobody knows where to find them or how to use them. And then the final one that I've got here is to start with a smaller scope. Perhaps do a field test. If the leadership team as a whole, there are people that are resisting the change, resisting the implementation of the leadership pipeline process at a national level, perhaps find a champion at the MCC level, somebody maybe in SLM, who really has these expansion plans, seeing a need for leadership, and is willing to implement these processes on a smaller scope, to field test these, to be able to show some positive results. And I believe that as results come out, as people see the effectiveness of it, that those doubters will come around and be willing to implement it at the national level. Or it might even be good to share real stories or best practices and testimonies from our country or even from other countries about the leadership pipeline process and its effectiveness. Terry, any questions that have come up?
I do have a couple for you. First of all, Dennis, you're mentioning there at the top a national strategy meeting as well as a people meeting.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of approximately how much time would need to be dedicated to those kinds of meetings?
Well, that's also a great question. The leadership strategy meeting is something perhaps at the beginning of the year or at the end of a ministry year. The leadership setting down. It could be a couple of hours just to brainstorm, to think through, and it's probably something the leadership development and human resources team needs to work on researching and resourcing first. But you're taking out the different national strategic plan as well as the ministry strategic plans, seeing where their expansion plans are. You're looking at current needs that need to be filled. We're looking at succession. People that we know will be leaving to go to the mission field, taking new leadership positions, therefore making their current position vacant. People that are retiring, things that we know about succession. So a couple of hours to think that. But like I said, it would be helpful for leadership development, human resources team to put in some legwork at first to make sure that all the data is available for that meeting. The people meeting is, it really depends on how many people we want to assess during that meeting. And you probably don't want to go more than 8 to 10 people. It could be 2 to maybe even 4 hours, depending on how much detail we get into. But we collect staff tracking data, some information from their team leaders to come up with an assessment. And there are some tools that we use for that. If there's a need later during the question-answer period, I can share some of those tools. Is that helpful?
That's very helpful, Dennis. Thanks. I do have one more question for you. You're mentioning there a national level, a national strategic plan and people meeting. Is this type of leadership pipeline process, is it helpful for others as well, not just national leaders?
Yeah, I think as far as going above the national level, the area level, even the global level, it's really helpful. As I mentioned, using it even at an MCC ministry level, I think the principles are helpful. I think as we designed the materials, we're thinking primarily of a national level, but they can be adapted and used at just about any level that we want to make sure that we have a leadership pipeline process in place.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. There's one more thing before we get into our question and answer period, and this is kind of another plug, another advertisement. We do have some LDHR Toolman leadership pipeline process videos. Okay, and you can find these at a couple of places. One, if you're a member of our LDHR Global Community GCX site, you'll find them there. There's the global community. You scroll down on the right-hand side of the page, you'll find the Toolman videos, and there are several different topics. The second topic there is the leadership pipeline process, and there's six videos there. If you're not a member of our GCX site, it does need an invitation. You do need to be invited to be a part of it, but contact one of us, to contact me or Paul or Terry, somebody on the resourcing team, and we can make sure you're connected to that. Another way that we can get connected here is through our global YouTube channel. And many people don't even know we have an LDHR global YouTube channel. But if you Google LDHR global YouTube. It gives you a link to our YouTube channel, and there are created playlists. And one of the created playlists is the Toolman videos. So there's different ways that you can locate these videos. They're very short videos. They're less than 5 minutes long. They deal with the steps, explaining the steps as well as the process, the tools that we use for that. So I just want to make a plug for that. I think it's a great tool, a great resource to use. Now, questions and answers. Any questions? We will make this PowerPoint and other notes available for you. In fact, we're recording the webinar as well, and so we'll make that available also for you. So if you missed something in the process, don't panic, but you can ask about it now.
Dennis, while we're waiting for people to type in some questions, I have one for you. How would you suggest, or what would you suggest would be the best way for a leader who wants to begin the leadership pipeline process in their scope of leadership? How should they best learn how to use the tools and the resources and kind of get this started?
That's a great question, Terry. I think the videos, the Toolman videos, are certainly a good first step. Very short videos explaining the steps and the tools involved. Go to the websites that we mentioned before, the People Pathways website, the Leader Transitions website, the Staff Development Cycle website, and there are some great explanations and tools that you can use on those websites.
Okay, thanks. And a few more questions coming in here. Which people should be involved in this process?
Well, yeah, I think probably the champion, maybe the driving force may usually be our leadership development human resources $LDHR teams. But the process for the leadership strategy meeting, the people meeting, the process should at the very least involve the entire leadership team, the national leadership team, to have an ownership of this process.
Excellent. And how many people should you be preparing for each of the roles that you're looking at when you're doing the leadership pipeline process?
Wow. Great questions. When you get to the selection process, you don't want to choose from a pool of one. It's easy to make hasty choices. Having like at least three candidates that we're assessing and we're considering for the role and go through the selection process with is probably a minimum, I would think.
That's really helpful. We'll give just a second or two for anyone else to possibly type in any questions, and I just want to repeat what you said, Dennis, that we will make the audio and the PowerPoint available from this webinar, and any other supporting materials, the links to the websites and some of the forms that you mentioned, so that people will be able to access them later and take time to review them and get really comfortable with them, so that they can use them in their own setting.
If no questions are coming out, let me just share with you some of the tools that we have for the different process. Very briefly, this is unsolicited, so if you don't feel the need to see these, you can shut off this part of our video. But I mentioned the Identify step. The key tool is the Identifying Leadership Needs worksheet, and you'll do this during the leadership strategy meeting. It looks kind of complicated right now, but it's just a one-page paper. It's something that when we started developing tools, there was a 7-page workforce need analysis and competency mapping worksheet that was extremely complicated. So we've reduced it to one simple page where we're looking at current leaders needed because of succession, leaders needed for expansion, and then a chance at the bottom to prioritize our leadership needs. So we make sure that we're working on filling the most priority leadership positions first. The assess tool is the staff tracking summary sheet and the people meeting summary sheet. And these are tools that once again have been shortened and simplified. There's a staff tracking summary sheet, which is a 2-page sheet that people that we want to assess in the people meeting should have their team leader fill up this sheet to give some information that we need to make sure we're making good choices. And then as we have our meeting, we're making a summary of each of the people that we're assessing, their general rating, kind of a stoplight pattern, red, not ready yet, yellow, have potential, need more development, and green, they're currently ready. And we include the next steps of development, potential role fits, as well as other comments and proposed timeline for them. And then our develop stage is the key developmental assignments from the position focus. Leader transitions, we're looking at selection and transition process. And we use a lot of the tools that we've used in the identify and the assess, as well as the develop stages here. We also have a candidate summary sheet, leader transition worksheet, and leader transition development plan. And these are to help make sure we're making the best choices in selecting the leader, as well as helping that person to make a fruitful transition into their leadership role. So those are some of the tools that we have, and once again, the websites as well as the toolkit, the Toolman videos will help in understanding how to implement those. We're hoping to have these webinars on a monthly basis, and next month's going to be a great webinar. It'll be Liboy de Velez, who will be sharing on the interior life of a leader, spirituality and leadership, and that will be April 20th, same time, 1 a.m. and 4 p.m. GMT.
Excellent. Thanks, Dennis. I will mention also that last month we did the Evaluate webinar talking about the Evaluate Lite tool for looking at the scope of the LDHR job. That webinar is available on YouTube also. So thank you, Dennis. It was really informative, really helpful, very encouraging, everything that you had to share. And thank you, everyone else, for joining with us. This webinar and the different tools and resources, website links, all of that Dennis mentioned will be uploaded soon. You'll see mention of it in the Facebook group, LDHR Global, and also on the LDHR community website and the YouTube channel. So there'll be lots of different ways for you to access it. So thank you again. We appreciate you all being with us, and we hope to see you next time.